Jimmy O here from JoBlo, and we are about to talk to my man, Alex Kurtzman.
Hi, how are you?
We're going to sit down and talk Mummy, Tom Cruise, effects, and the monster universe.
Get down! Go, go, go! Oh no, we're gonna die!
What the hell? I've been watching the previews, and I think the second preview was even better.
Oh, thank you.
How involved are you in putting this together? Like getting the trailers and all that stuff. You seem like you're heavily involved with that.
I have been heavily involved, although I will say that the marketing department at Universal is amazing. They really are hands down amazing. And I think the thing that's so critical about the sort of the DNA ingredients that go into making a trailer really work is when there's a real connection between the filmmakers and the marketing department, and everybody knows that they're saying the same thing. It's very, very important that they're selling the same thing, that they're expressing the same ideas. That when that doesn't happen, and I've been in those situations too, there's a lot of dissonance, and people are very confused about what they're being sold. You know what I mean? It's bad. So Josh and his team are amazing, and I think they're very smart. They come from a background of not saying, what is the idea that we're selling as much as what is the emotion that we're selling, and how do we make that clear to people? Obviously in the case of The Mummy, it's not just the movie, but it's the kind of world that's being built.
Yeah.
And so we're defining a tone, and a lot of work that goes into the filmmaking and defining the tone then hopefully translates to the marketing of it. So when we were in the middle of shooting, Josh and his team flew out to London to show us their first pass on the trailer, and Tom and I looked at each other and went, "This is fantastic," because everybody was so just in sync about what we were trying to say. And it gave us comfort. I also actually believe I've had experiences. I really had it. The first time I really saw it work was on Fringe, when Joe Early and his team at Fox at the time had come up with all these amazing designs. These crazy sort of like the six-fingered hand and all these really cool things that actually we had not written any stories yet. And they showed us these designs that were so inspired that it inspired us to write episodes around the designs and then to embed them in the show and to make them meaningful. And that was super cool. So a great marketing department can be your best friend because they take your storytelling and they enhance it. And a bad marketing department is your worst enemy ever.
To a new world of gods and monsters.
Speaking of world building, I mean, this is so exciting. How did you start with The Mummy, and why was that the character to go with for you?
Well, it kind of happened because I don't know, for me personally, I love the monsters, and I have loved them since I was a kid. And I remember seeing Boris Karloff come to life for the first time. And it was pretty terrifying as a kid, just the slowness of it, and the way that whole scene played out, which is the opening scene of the movie. Mm-hmm. And The Mummy is obviously a very well-known character around the world, and so there was an obvious mandate from the studio to say, let's look at The Mummy because it's such a beloved property. Now, they have a tremendous amount of affection and love and pride in their monsters. The studio was built on the monsters, and they call them our monsters because they are their monsters. And I think they felt like, is there a way to take The Mummy, which is probably an easier entry point than some of the other monsters, in that it's already, the world is familiar with it, and come up with a fresh way to tell the story. So, it kind of organically happened that way, to be honest. We started developing a couple other monster movies, different characters, but The Mummy kind of rose to the top. And I just remembered sort of feeling, what I felt as a kid and looking for a way to harness some of that in this movie. And I was particularly inspired by the Karloff Mummy.
It seems tricky too, in a way, because you're dealing with you had the Karloff film, you also had the Brendan Fraser films, the Steven Soderbergh movies. Yeah. Was it tricky to take those movies and go, okay, I don't want to make that, and I don't, was it? Where did you find the balance?
I mean, look, I have nothing but respect for all the filmmakers who made mummy movies before, and I think that what Summers did in the 90s was he obviously took something that at that time hadn't been done that way and made it fresh for the time, and that was great and amazing, and my hat's off to him completely. I think that it was less about saying, let's avoid other things, and more about saying, what do I want to see that I haven't seen before? How do I make it feel fresh and different? And that's a question that we asked ourselves every day on set over and over again. Are we hitting that standard? So it was less about avoiding things as much as it was about trying to find a way to explore new ground.
Welcome to Prodigium, Mr. Morton.
Speaking of new ground, you're introducing Jekyll and Hyde. You're doing a lot of really exciting stuff.
Yeah.
How do you manipulate telling that story by still building, and do it well?
Look, here, the way that I kind of look at it, we obviously there's a mandate to build the monster universe, and I'm excited by that. I mean, as a fan, I would want to see that universe. I do fundamentally believe that the only way to do that correctly is to give the audience great individual films. And so we were not eager to do a monster mashup right away, even though the monsters predated the Marvel mashups by literal decades. Frankenstein versus Wolfman was the first ever, and it was the first to put them together. But that movie worked because they already done, I think, 3 Frankensteins and 3 Wolfmans, and they didn't know what else to do with each individual character. So they said, well, what if we put them together? And suddenly it got very exciting to see what would happen when you put those 2 monsters together. So I think that what I felt was I can only judge it by what I feel as an audience member. What do I want to see? And I don't like universes being shoved down my throat when I feel like they haven't earned my acceptance of the characters in them yet. I want a full meal of each character, and once I fall in love with those characters, then bring them together, and it'll be really exciting. So knowing that this was a mummy story, first and foremost, we did that. There was a certain point where it became clear that we needed and wanted a character who kind of who opened the door to the larger universe of monsters. And the question became, well, do we invent a character, somebody who, Joe Schmo, or JoBlo, or do we actually look to the universe to mine a character who would organically fit into that story? And it had to be somebody who had been exploring the nature of evil and who had potentially been around a lot longer than maybe we understood. And the minute we started sort of looking at that, and then when we started thinking about that this character needed in some ways to reflect what Nick, Tom's character, is going through, Dr. Jekyll kind of rose to the surface because he himself has been where Nick is going. And the minute we had an organic reason to put him in the story, not just a, hey, let's throw these characters together to see what happens reason, it felt like the right thing to do. It felt like we could justify it.
Just stay with me.
I'm scared.
I'm going to figure this out.
Don't leave me.
I feel like we're going to see more horror than the trailer is showing us. How am I correct on this? That's what I thought. How scary are we going to get? Well, without giving anything away.
No. Here's the thing. I'm not going to lie and tell you that it's a straight up horror movie, because it's not at all. And I think one of the unique challenges of this movie was figuring out the balance between the what you would expect from a monster movie and a modern monster movie, which I think would involve some horror and adventure. And it's also got to have humor, and it's also got to be emotional. It's a tall order. It's a lot of things that have to coexist. I think I sort of go back to Tom and I spoke a lot about suspense, and that I think our deep feeling is that the truest horror comes from suspense, not necessarily from slashers are a whole other category. That's just a different thing, and that's not what we're doing at all. But suspense, holding an audience in a state of terror, is about sometimes showing very little and and then letting them have it right at the right moment. So I think it was about really looking at how we use suspense more than horror to tell our story, and yet you have to acknowledge that when you're making a monster movie, if you don't deliver some real scares, then something's wrong.
Yeah.
You know, people are going to be really disappointed. They're going to be angry. I would feel it. You know.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that was the challenge, was finding the balance between those things. But you know, there are some straight up classic monster movie moments in the movie, and I think they're necessary. I think they're necessary for a modern audience. I'm also constantly amazed by what has now become defining of a family film. You know, Jurassic World has some scary things in it.
Yeah, yeah.
For little kids, like, oh my God, you know, the nanny getting eaten, you're like, oh my God.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and that has become okay, you know, for family fare. I mean, obviously it's not a small, you know, it's not the Disney standard of family fare,
Yeah.
but, you know, Jurassic did okay. So
Yeah.
it seems
I believe
like
in
families
King
went.
Kong
Yeah,
Skull Island had
absolutely.
that scene with the
Totally.
spider. That was terrifying.
Yeah, that's right. That scene was really scary, and but again, like, to me, that's a great example. That scene in Kong, to me, is more about suspense than it is horror.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's about sort of a sudden shock. You know, when the bamboo turns into you realize it's the leg, but then it's kind of about. If I remember correctly, I don't think you see a ton in that scene.
No,
it's not wildly gruesome.
No, it's not. I think there's a quick shot.
It's a quick shot.
You know,
right,
yeah,
down
yeah.
the throat. Right,
Exactly.
That's right. Now I remember. Yeah, I had fun. Actually, I had fun at that movie, and I think that's the key. It's like you're constantly walking up to the line, and then you're going. Look, as a kid, one of the things that was so exciting about Spielberg movies was how close to R they always felt. You know what I mean? That, like, Temple of Doom, which obviously is the movie that PG-13 was created for.
Yeah.
You know, it was an incredible thing to see that. I mean, even in Raiders, to see you know, Tote's face melt at the end, you're like, oh my God, I'd never seen anything like that, and I was 8 years old. It felt dangerous and exciting and unpredictable, mostly unpredictable. You know, it would come out of the blue, and you'd be like, oh my God, I can't believe that, you know, they did that.
Let's turn out the light.
The time has come.
Where are we?
Look.
Look and wonder.
I shall awaken memories of terror and triumph, of love and crime and death. Your spirit that has wandered through so many forms and so many ages.
Obviously, we're going to move further with more characters.
Yeah.
Who are the ones you're excited about taking on?
Well, I'm super excited about Bride. I mean, Bride is a really interesting one because if you look at the Bride of Frankenstein, she only appears in the last 5 or 10 minutes of the movie.
Yeah.
She rejects Frankenstein. He pulls a lever. They all explode. End of movie. And you're like, wait a minute, that's it? It's one of the weirdest movies ever made, but it's delightful in its own crazy way, and I find it amazing that sort of like, you know, you, for a character who's only on screen for such a limited amount of time, you remember that look. It's such an iconic look, and it's sort of shocking to think, wait, she was only on screen for a couple minutes. Like, I thought she was on that. I thought the movie's called Bride of Frankenstein. I thought she was, but she's not. Similarly, in The Mummy, you think of the bandages, but he's actually only in the bandages for the first scene in the movie, and then he's wearing a tunic for the rest of the movie.
Yeah.
It's really weird, but you don't think of it that way. Those images, those designs, those creature designs, those costumes are so iconic, and they have endured for so long because they're so specific and so special. And so I'm, you know, that's sort of a roundabout way of answering your question, but I'm really excited about Bride because I love the idea of, David Koepp wrote a really clever script. And he did some really smart things with structure, and he came up with a wonderful pairing for Bride that is fascinating. I'm not going to say any more than that.
Yeah.
But like really fun, and actually really retains the spirit of what I think I'd want to see from it. And you know, we're taking all these characters and we're putting them in a modern context, which is really fun because it's such a weird challenge to figure out how to do it, you know. But he wrote a great script, and we're so excited about it, and you know, so I'm really excited about that. I'm really excited about Creature from the Black Lagoon.
Yeah.
Creature, for me, was one of the movies that I think defines the first sort of action, horror, adventure creature movie. I mean, there are shots in Creature that are literally the shots from Jaws. And I had no idea until I saw Creature. I was like, wait a minute. They did it like 40 years before Jaws came out. I mean, the shot of her swimming above and the camera in the water looking up, all that stuff, camera following her in the water, all that stuff was done in Creature. But I think for me, what I love about Creature is the potential for... I think our thesis is that all of these monsters are interesting reflections of humanity. There's a depth to them. There's an emotional value to them. The monsters reflect something about us. And I've said this before, but I think the thing that makes the Universal monsters really unique, and really a genre unto themselves, is that it's the only genre where you fear the monster and you fear for the monster. And that's not something that you ever apply to a slasher movie or anything like that, you know, or a lot of horror movies. That's just not the case.
I mean, they try lately with slasher movies.
They do try, although it's tricky because once you're in slasher territory, it's just really tough to do that. But those monster movies are character films. They are all of them character films, you know. And I love that we could take something like Creature and say, well, if you look at the DNA of Creature, it's a love story, right? I mean, this creature saw this woman, was fascinated, infatuated, wanted to have her, wanted to be with her, but can't because he's not human. So when you start thinking about it from those terms, almost from the monster's point of view, and you go, what if it's a story of a creature that wants to connect to a human being and can't because it can't speak and it's not a human being, but it wants to be part of that world. It's kind of an emotional idea. And that being said, then it's a badass creature with some really cool, you know, abilities, and it's a monster still. And that's the thing. One of the standards that Chris Morgan and I talk about a lot when we're talking about these monsters is if a human being can solve the problem, then it shouldn't be in the movie. It sort of betrays it being a monster movie, you know. And the other thing I love about the monsters is that the assumption going into the movie is that the characters are broken, and there isn't an expectation from the audience that they're necessarily going to get fixed and be better by the end, because then they wouldn't be monsters anymore, you know? I love that. I think that's really different and really fresh, you know, in a world where everything kind of has to have a neat, tidied up resolution at the end for the most part. I think the monsters allow for something a little different.
You're still here. It's over. Go home. What are you expecting? Sam Jackson show up with an eye patch and a saucy little leather number? Go.